We've got an all-star crew here today to have a good discussion on the budget. As you might can tell, I'm not Talmadge Heflin, I'm sorry to say. Talmadge should be coming over shortly. He had another event that came up where he was speaking at, but he should be over here soon, so we may switch out whenever he gets here. But this is the panel, Show Me the Money, the fight over future budget priorities. So one of the things, the biggest thing I think legislators pass every session is a budget. It's really the only thing, I guess, that you have to pass. Sometimes it may last a little longer, but they've done a great job over the last couple of sessions. One thing that we look at, and most of you know about this, is the conservative Texas budget. And we have a coalition of about 16 partners, and one of those main priorities is to pass a budget that doesn't increase by more than population growth and inflation. Well, why that measure matters? Well, we tend to think that's a good measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay. You have more people coming into Texas, they could pay for more taxes, maybe need more services. You have inflation. Inflation is tied to wage growth, so that also gives the opportunity to pay for more taxes. And so it's something to keep as a good metric over time. Well, the last two sessions, 2015, 2017, the legislature passed budgets that were below population growth plus inflation. So we've had back-to-back conservative budgets. And this session, yeah, I think it's great. Yeah, give him a hand. Yeah. And this session, we're hoping to do the same thing again. We're hoping that they'll do the same thing, because if you keep spending in control, we can also keep taxes from rising. Spending is what ultimately drives taxes overall. And so when we're thinking about this, you got to think about, well, the comptroller just said that there's an 8.1% increase in general revenue related funds. That was in what's called the biennial revenue estimate that he puts out before session starts. It kind of gives them a roadmap of how much revenue that they'll have, the legislature will have, in order to spend. And you also want to think about, well, how can taxpayers be a part of those priorities as well? You know, there's a lot of talk about property tax relief, and we talked about a little bit of that today. But you also have demands such as healthcare, such as education, transportation. Y'all have driven on a lot of these roads, right? Some are better than others, and so some of those things are going on. We also have a rainy day fund, which at the end of the current biennium and the end of fiscal year 19 said to have about $12.5 billion. The comptroller said at the end of the upcoming biennium would be a little over $15 billion. So that's a growing source of revenue as well. So there's a lot of things to talk about. I'm really excited about this discussion that we're going to have today. And let me turn it over to them. Let me intro them first. So right next to me here is Representative John Zerwas. I should say Chairman John Zerwas. Sorry, sir. He's been serving... Yeah, well, that's true. None of the committee assignments have been named yet. But that's how I know you as Chairman Zerwas. He's served his seventh legislative term in the Texas House of Representatives and member of the Legislative Budget Board. In 2017, was named Chairman of the House Appropriations Committee by Speaker Joe Strauss. And they're waiting on assignments, that's what we're talking about now, which could come out, I don't know, maybe the end of the month, maybe early next month, sometime soon. He previously served 8 years in the House Appropriations Committee. He's a physician for more than 30 years and past president of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. He has earned numerous accolades for his dedication to public service, including being twice named one of the 10 best legislators by Texas Monthly. Please give him a round of applause. Next to him is Representative Donna Howard. She has served on the Texas House of Representatives since 2006. She currently serves as the Vice Chair of the Vice Chair of Calendars Committee. Is a member of the House Appropriations Committee and a longtime member of the House Higher Education Committee and the House Administration Committee. A lot of committees. It's good, yeah. Keep busy. She was elected to the Eanes ISD Board in West Austin for the 1996 and 1999 term. She has served on the boards of Austin area Interreligious Ministries, Common Cause Texas, Texas Freedom Network, and the Texas Campaign to Prevent Teen Pregnancy. She now serves as a board member of the Expanding Horizons Foundation, supporting low-income housing and education. Please give her a round of applause. Next to her is Senator John Whitmire. He was elected to the Texas Senate in 1982 after serving 10 years in the Texas House of Representatives. With over 35 years of service in Texas Senate, he ranks first in seniority and is the Dean of the Senate. Is that still true? Dean? All right. Because that doesn't change, right? That doesn't change.
It was when I went when I left the Capitol yesterday.
Oh, okay. All right, good. He's chair, he was chair of the Senate Criminal Justice Committee, a member of the Senate Business and Commerce Committee, and served as a member of the Senate Finance Committee. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Houston and attended the Bates College of Law. He's admitted to the State Bar, Texas State Bar in 1981 as attorney of counsel to the law firm Locke Lord LLP. Please give him a round of applause. So thank you all for being here today. Is this on? Can y'all hear me? All right, good. We've got a lot to talk about. Just a small thing called the budget, and all of you are key parts of what happens with the budget and affects all of our everyday lives, and we appreciate what you all do. If you would, maybe give some opening remarks about what you think about the budget, what's going to happen this session, and really anything else you want to talk about. Here's one right here. Oh, you want to? Yeah.
Well,
go.
I was going to defer to the dean, you know.
Yeah.
Sounds like a.
Start off with
I'm
the
on.
right foot.
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for having us here today, and I guess I'll start out and say I'm not sure why I was invited, because I don't subscribe to y'all's arbitrary limits on spending. I'm very concerned about the state's fiscal welfare, our services that we're providing. I have been here a long time. We didn't get in what I'm going to describe in recent years. It's been a long time building. For instance, I don't think we meet the needs of most Texans. And I'm worried, even with the extra money that has been discussed, we might continue the inefficiencies, the waste that has become part of our budgetary system. For instance, we were told yesterday we were going to put $800 million again on the border, even with the U.S. Army down there, with the feds having beefed up border security. And I've been to the border, and I've seen the 24-hour reports from law enforcement. And Joan Huffman and I were down there last year, and I said, Joan, after that report, I wish we had a report like that in Houston. The border is much safer than many of our major cities' gang activity sections. Just one example. Do we want border security? Yes, but $800 million, that I believe was an arbitrary figure. Much of it goes for DPS overtime. But that's just one example. I think we have such unmet needs that if you do what we've done in the last two sessions and spend according to the population growth and inflation, we still won't have a mental health system. And I would challenge all of us, let's get up and walk 2 blocks from here and look at Austin's overcrowded homeless shelter. Half of them are going to have mental health issues. So I would not subscribe to an arbitrary ceiling on spending until we take care of our mental health issue, which becomes a criminal justice issue. Higher ed is getting to where working families can barely afford to send their kids to college because we deregulated tuition because the legislature will not spend enough on higher ed. So I could spend the morning talking about our serious needs. Surely we haven't fixed this congestion on our roads. TxDOT has gotten serious infusion of money in recent sessions, but we have transportation. Houston, we terribly need some not only repairs from Harvey, but we need prevention. We desperately need another reservoir. The two were compromised. They released the water, flooded taxpayers' homes. We need about $500 million for that. So are you going to continue to leave unspent money in the rainy day fund when Houston and other communities are under the threat of flooding? So that's why I'm here today. Serena, I was excited to be here. And in fact, I do often back in the district when I'm asked to talk about the state of the state. I'll do it this morning. If anybody can really tell me a program, a subject in state government that is adequately funded, doesn't have a waiting list, certainly it's not CPS. Federal courts declared that dysfunctional. You tell me, and I'll yield my time. If you want to just tell me something you're doing with the state of Texas that is hitting on all cylinders and working well. And that's when I would start saying, yeah, let's limit it to population growth and inflation. But I hear it daily. I work in the field daily in areas. Public education, didn't even mention that. And most of the leadership in Austin today will tell you we're going to fix that. And I applaud that, but I haven't seen the plan yet. And what worries me is we'll put some rainy day funds, a significant amount, into a broken school finance system, or we're still going to have 1,050 school districts when we leave here come June. And no reasonable conservative would think we need 1,050 school districts. We don't have that many teachers to go around, quite frankly. And not only that, I would like to start over with school finance and public school education and get real about fixing that, to me, start completely over and come up with an education system that performs as we would like and would be cost effective. So I'm sorry if I talk too much, but I kind of got worked up.
Well, Senator, you said, why do we invite you? And that was exactly the reason why we invited you. We like the discussion.
Hey, let me, I always start it off back home. We are obviously living in the best place in America and probably the world. So don't think that I'm negative on the state of Texas. Don't leave here that. I just want it to be better. Yeah. And unfortunately, we only have 140 days. And you take the weekends and the Easter holidays, we've already used 4 of them this week. We better get busy because there's a lot of things to do. And I'm proud to be here with 2 outstanding state representatives.
Thank you, sir. Representative Howard.
Well, I was going to suggest that Chairman Zerwas go first because I think we should sandwich him in because he might have a different perspective.
Yes.
I do have seniority.
No.
Yes.
Sounds good.
Go. You want me to go? Okay, well then I will. All right. We'll just continue the vein in which we started this discussion. I actually share a lot of what Senator Whitmire was talking about in terms of just looking at the limitations on growth tied to population and inflation. One of the challenges I think we have with that is not only the inadequacy of funding certain state services and then limiting without taking that into account, but also the fact that we don't have a static economy and a static society. I would suggest that we wouldn't necessarily want to tie the technological advances to what we were doing, 20, 30 years ago. There are times when things shift and you've got to invest in the necessary infrastructure. For instance, the broadband connectivity that we're trying to put into place across the state. We made huge progress, thank you, Chairman, this last time with matching E-rate funds for public education and have 95%, I'm not sure what the final number is, but close to 100% of our school districts now are going to be connected, have broadband connectivity, which is huge for us in terms of the kind of 21st century learning that we need to have taking place and making sure that those that are in rural areas in our state have the same kind of access to quality public education. So that's a big thing. But it does require additional dollars that are different from what the status quo was. So I get concerned about having some kind of a limitation that is imposed that doesn't allow us the flexibility as appropriators to determine what, from everything we're gathering from the state and from constituents, what is the best way to move forward. I think we know that we want to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollar. And I think by and large, no matter what you think of some of us on the Democratic side and of the ledger here, that we also want to be good stewards of the taxpayer dollar. And in fact, I don't even like to say conservative, liberal, progressive budgets, whatever. I think it needs to be a responsible budget. And that means that we look at what the needs of our state are so that we can have strong communities, strong families that can contribute to our economy. We look at that and then we determine what are the best ways to meet that, how much should it cost, and how do we want to pay for it. So for me, a lot of the issue's been around our discussion in honest terms about what's going on with the budget. So not to go into the depth of it right now, but just as a for instance, we are required by our Constitution to have a balanced budget, and we do. But as the chairman will tell you, we balance it with certain accounting mechanisms, but also utilizing dedicated funds that we have collected from you in some way for some particular purpose, and then did not appropriate it for that purpose, and instead used those funds and held on to them to certify the budget. And I don't know what the current number is. It's $4 or $5 billion of our budget that is being done with accounting mechanisms rather than actually having that money. So to Senator Whitmire's point too, it's hard to talk about limitations when we're not even fully and adequately funding the budget that we have right now without using these accounting gimmicks, some would say. Legitimate though they may be. So anyway, that's just kind of an overview. There's a lot that we can talk about here, but I'll let the chairman take over.
We'll have time to do that as well. Thank you so much, Chairman.
Well, thank you, Vance, and thank you all for being here and the opportunity to be with these folks up here. It's always a great opportunity to be on panels with the senator and with Representative Howard. We all bring some different views there, but we all share the same intent to try to serve the citizens of Texas and Texans in the best way possible. And a lot of that is ultimately reflected in the budget. I'll start off by just kind of what you laid out there as far as do we have limits on what we spend? Yeah, in fact, the Constitution says we have to establish a spending limit. We will do that this afternoon, in fact. We typically do that in November, but because we didn't have a real good sense of where we were going to be on the needs for school finance, we punted on that until today, in fact. And I think we have a better sense of where we're going to need to come in on that and stuff. So just to kind of give you, how we get to the budget and where we are as of today, we spend several months prior to coming into session in developing the budget. The agencies produce their LARs, legislative appropriations requests. Then typically members of the Legislative Budget Board, of which I serve on that and several others do, sit and go through all of these agencies' proposed budgets for a period of several weeks that ends in about the first week or two of December. And from that, then, we in the House and in the Senate produce separate budgets. The House bill will be the first budget to be rolled out this time. Last time it was the Senate budget. And we alternate like that every other year. There's no rule that happens, but that has typically been the way that we've done it. And then that budget then will be, the basics of it will be reported out probably on Monday or Tuesday of next week. That's actually constitutionally mandated also. And so that's how we kind of get there. And nowhere along the line here you'll recognize we need to be within population and inflation. Now, I know TPPF embraces that as one of the best ways in order to kind of, serve as a marker for the budget. But there's nothing that says we have to do that, and there were bills last time that said that we would have to adopt that as law, if you will. But we do, in fact, do adopt a spending limit. And sometimes it is the population and inflation number. Sometimes it's actually even a more conservative number, like it was last session. Now, the spending limit didn't matter last session because we didn't have any money to spend. So we basically had the same money that we had from the previous 2 years, and we had to make that work. So there was no growth in the budget, and Vance came over smiling and happy and patting me on the back, and I was already all beat up over that, So, but we did. We put together a budget that essentially did not grow despite population growth and despite inflation, which obviously means we had to rein in some of our spending in certain places. So that's one that basically was just dictated by the economic times that we're in. Contrast that with 2015, where we had what we thought was a load of money then, similar to where we are today. And the spending limit did matter in that case. And in fact, that was even though under population and inflation, and it met other ways that we can kind of sort of define what's the marker in the ground that we're going to use. We don't have to use any given marker or metric that's defined to us. The LBB is just going to adopt a number, and it may or may not coincide with that. And we'll adopt that today. I don't know what it's going to be, but we'll.
I thought you were going to let us know. Oh.
Yeah, but it'll be a number that certainly will work for the state of Texas. I think the biggest thing that we heard going into this budget session. Remember, we don't know what the BRE is when we develop the budget. We're just working off of what perhaps the LBB gives us a sense of what they anticipate revenues to be. But we're creating a budget based on what the agencies feel like they need and what we feel like is reasonable to be able to afford and stuff. And so the budget that will come out that you'll hear about next week will be a reflection of that, at least from the House side. The Senate side will have theirs. Senator Nelson sits through the same boards of review that I do, and typically the vice chair of appropriations may sit on that also. And Representative Oscar Longoria has also sat in on quite a few of those sessions as we develop the budget. But I do think this budget is going to be one that certainly is going to fall within what the BRE is. I think this budget is going to be well within population and inflation, at least what we're going to report out come next week. There are going to be some things in there that are very, very serious priorities for the state of Texas. And the number one after what I consider the two most important priorities, which is Harvey recovery and school safety. But the third one, and you put them all together, basically is school finance and property tax reform and relief. You can't do one without the other. And so what this budget will reflect is a very, very strong emphasis on that, and it will be within what the BRE is, and it will be within, at least as we go into this, within the population and inflation growth marker as a place that we need to be. Nice. I'll also just bring up, we talked a little bit about, living within our means here and stuff. The only time that we have busted the spending limit, and we can do that, we can constitutionally, we're allowed to bust the spending limit by a significant vote. We did that in 2007, and it was over school finance. Yeah. It was over the same issue, and it was a significant bust in the spending cap, in fact. And so where there is those times where we recognize a very serious and important issue that needs to be addressed, which at that time, and I know both of y'all were involved in that conversation because it came out of the special session in 2006. But in 2007, I was involved in it as my freshman session and on appropriations committee, and obviously as a member, voted to bust the spending limit a significant amount in order to compress those property taxes.
That's good. Well, thank you all for those opening comments. And just so the audience is clear too, our current spending limit is based on personal income growth. And the LBB will look at a number of indicators, estimates of what that growth rate will be, and then they'll adopt it. Last session was kind of interesting because the one that you all adopted was based on population inflation, if I remember correctly. It was 8%.
It actually was below it. It may have coincidentally been the same, but it actually was below that.
Gotcha. So, yeah. And 2 sessions ago, population was inflation metric was 6.5%. Last session was 4.5%. This time is actually 8%. When I did the math, what I do is just look at the last 2 years, fiscal years, and calculate population growth in the state and look at CPI, and you add those two together, it was 8%. For me, that was pretty high. It's like, wow.
It's your number.
8%, I know. We had 6.5, 4.5, and now 8%. Wow. And then when the BRE came out of 8%, it looks like that would be still below population growth and inflation. And so I know there's some discussion about whether or not that's the key measure to use. Well, we just feel like that's a good measure for the average taxpayer's ability to pay. But I wonder, where do y'all see the demands for this session? I mean, you talked about Harvey. How much do you think we'll need for Harvey recovery? My sister, who lived in Houston, her house was flooded, and I just saw a lot of the damage that was happened down there. How is that going to influence the overall budget this cycle for a supplemental bill that maybe you can kind of go over there?
Well, I'll kick it off and say, one, I flooded in Harvey also, so I witnessed that and experienced it. A significant amount of that in my district. The senator certainly had a significant amount in the Houston area and stuff. We were able to cobble together the financial needs immediately by the governor's ability to move money out of other agencies to pay for what were the immediate needs. Obviously, that leaves a hole. Sometimes we intentionally leave holes, like we did in Medicaid, and have done pretty much every session that I've been here. But with the anticipation that we would have money available in order to make those budgets whole, and we would have money if there were additional needs that were not taken care of out of that money, And there was clearly a understanding that from the governor, lieutenant governor, of course, Speaker Strauss at the time, that we would tap into the rainy day fund to do that. So there's not really any debate about that this time. The new thing this time, though, that was unexpected to me, but very, very much good news, is the $4.1 billion in surplus that we will have during this session. After this session, that started out as $95 million, you know, and then we had a revised estimate that put it at $2.7 billion. And then, of course, on Monday, the comptroller indicated it would be in the order of $4.1 billion.
The faster economic growth.
Well, it's a fast economic growth. We also are going, all the numbers seem to be lining up very well. The shortfall, if you will, due to Medicaid shortfall and other things, is actually going to be substantially less than what we thought it was. Yeah, and a big part of that is offset by school enrollment wasn't as much as we had actually predicted it would be and stuff. So, and we also had a better FMAP, which is the matching funds that come down from the federal government to largely our healthcare entities and stuff. That's a very favorable rate to us, and very small movements in that is hundreds of millions of dollars that we can count on. And so a lot of those things have played out well. So you're seeing less of a shortfall than we thought. We're seeing certainly a greater BRE than we thought. We're seeing a rainy day fund that I thought would grow, but grew substantially more than I thought. And the BRE is much larger than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. Who else would?
Yeah, I would just, first of all, I want to put out, for a matter of fact, I know elections matter, okay? The chairman and others are reflecting the makeup of the legislature and the state leadership. I think there's no accident, though, that people sent a message, certainly as regards to school property taxes this last November, that they're unhappy. So the elections got a lot closer, and we have new members in the House and the Senate because I think people are disgusted. And it's not just on school finance and school property taxes, but I think people are disgusted and sitting in traffic. And, you know, I take the calls from parents that have 14-year-olds with a bipolar issue, and where do they go for help? Unfortunately, I have to tell them, and it's a tough message, he or she are going to have to commit a crime and get in the juvenile probation system before they get in mental health services. So if you don't like conditions, the cost of your property taxes, you can continue to support no growth. Can you imagine? Last session, we came into town and left with absolutely no growth, even though we get about 1,500 new residents each and every day. You couldn't run your family that way, in my judgment, and I know I can't run mine. So I personally think it's unfortunate that the system, as the chair described, and he understands it much better than I do from a standpoint of the technical decisions that have to be made. Yeah, state agencies request what they're allowed to request. I mean, I work with TDCJ. They're 3,000 correction officers short because they can't ask for a budget that would give sufficient salaries to have safe prisons. You know what you do when you're 3,000 correction officers short? Instead of 2 men guarding the gate, or 2 ladies guarding the gate, so one can run for help if they get attacked, they've got 1 person there. That jeopardizes our community, jeopardizes the other correction officers. I mean, I want to put a face on what we're talking about. It's great to talk about percentages of growth, but I want us this morning to think about the people that need services. I went out to Ben Taub, our large county charitable hospital, 2 weeks ago on a Friday night, because I had been told, Senator, we're stacking up residents that have needs, psychiatric needs. We call over the Harris County Psychiatric Hospital, there's no beds. So what do? They try to stabilize them through drugs and then return them back to the streets of Houston. So, you know, it's to me, awful that we left the session last time with $11 billion in a rainy day fund. going to be 15 this year. And we will spend down some of it. And I don't like labels conservative, liberal either, because I don't know what they really mean. I think I sound like a conservative this morning myself, because I want efficiencies. What concerns me from a fiscal responsibility, let's call it that, we're going to go into the rainy day fund, give teachers some salary increases, reduce school property taxes, and that's, you can't go into a surplus like that with ongoing costs. What are you going to do for the property tax reduction next session, or the cost of education? So for political purposes, in my judgment, we're going to go into the rainy day fund, which we wouldn't do 2 years ago, because some people got some messages during the fall campaign that school property taxes are putting people out of their homes. So we're going to make an investment there, and we're going to raise teacher salaries because some people got messages that teachers are upset. So, you know, I just don't like formulas. I would personally, and I've been here a long time, let's come to Austin, listen to the needs, and don't put political pressure on agency directors and board members to not ask for what they truly need. TDCJ will not come in and make a strong enough argument that we still have no treatment for drug and alcohol in our state jails. We will release people that are sent to prison for DWIs. 3 DWIs in Harris County will get you 5 years in the state prison. We will release several thousand this year from prison that were sent there for a DWI problem, and they did not get 1 day of alcohol counseling. And you know what they're going to do? They're going to endanger our lives because they're going to go back out and reoffend. Those are the kind of issues that I wish the budget was written around.
And one thing I will say, Senator Whitmire, is I commend you for the work that you've done on criminal justice reform over the years.
Sure.
Something that was very conservative is you were able to close down a lot of prisons. And that was able to save money over time.
Through treatment.
Through treatment, right. So yeah, I hear you.
But we need more.
Sure. Representative Howard?
There's several things to talk about. I'm trying to figure out how to limit this because you start getting us going and we don't stop. But I'm thinking about what you said, John, about the school finance reform and property tax reform, because they do go hand in hand. And we've been trying to figure out how to make that work. Part of the challenge we have with funding public education is that we have an antiquated formula that doesn't take into effect current cost of education, doesn't take into effect the current weighted system that we've had in place for decades. So just even updating those things is very challenging because it means you create winners and losers in a system that keeps the same size pie but just slices the pie differently. So part of what our challenge has been is to figure out, can you really get buy-in from all the representatives of all the constituencies in this state by just keeping the same size pie, and that really has not worked. So when we've had opportunities to expand the pie a bit, we have done some of that, but we still haven't made the changes in the formula itself. And back in 2006, when we had those special sessions, we got to a place finally where we were getting the state back up to being at least a partner in providing public education and paying for about half of the cost split between the state and the local. So I'm leaving the federal part out, but about half and half, state and local. But because of the way the formula is based on property values, as property values have gone up over time, being market driven, going up over time, the state's portion, because of the way the formula works, has diminished. So it's gone down from being about 50% to, at the end of this current biennium, being around 35% perhaps, in the 30s anyway. A lot of people believe that we should be more of an equal partner and get back to 50%, but let me tell you what the cost would be, because I have a famous piece of legislation from last session that we heard in John's Appropriations Committee that probably had the highest fiscal note ever. I was going to have a constitutional amendment that would require that the state maintain 50% of the cost of public education. The fiscal note on that was $23 billion.
Wow.
Okay? Yeah. That's over time what has happened since we did the property tax compression. and put all that in place, replaced some of our local property tax dollars with state dollars back in 2007. So you get my point here that this is not an easy thing to solve. If we want the state to put more in, we need to figure out a way to incrementally do that, and we need to find new revenue streams that are sustainable if we're going to get back to having more of taking the burden off of local property taxpayers who have continued to have this cost shifted onto their backs. And it's not necessarily, there are probably some exceptions. Bottom line, those increased property taxes are being driven by the state legislature's formula for how we fund public education. And until we change that formula and find some way perhaps to have tax compression again with other revenue filling that gap, then we will not see any relief for the property taxpayers. So that's a huge thing. And then the other thing that I'm very interested in talking about and pursuing is what we're doing with the Economic Stabilization Fund, or the Rainy Day Fund, which you've heard all of us talking about how flush that fund is. Never anticipating it was going to have this kind of money in it. Way more than what the rating agencies even say that you need to have to maintain in your so-called savings account. It's virtually in a mattress. It's being invested below inflation. We're not maintaining purchasing power. The comptroller's proposal for a legacy fund, again, to me, is responsible budgeting, looking at how do we use money that we have and spin off new money from that we can use to fund some of our underfunded liabilities, free up GR to do some of the things we need to do. That makes a lot of sense to me. We're still talking about a prudent, conservative investment, but at a higher yield that will at least beat inflation. So there's a lot of things that we're talking about, I think, right now that are going to be impacting decisions we make about the budget. Big things that we're talking about that we need to have a lot of debate and discussion about, because these are really going to impact overall what the bottom line is going to be.
That's good. Thank you. One of the things that we've been looking at, speaking of school finance and property tax relief, is if you found a way to maybe limit spending. We've thrown out a number of like 4% growth, and use any money above the 4% to buy down the school maintenance and operation property tax over time. Some of the numbers that I've looked at, we could actually do it in a decade. We could eliminate the school maintenance and operation property tax to where the state was funding 100%. So it would just be a 50-50 share, it'd be 100%. Because at the end of the day,
With what? I'm sorry, with what would the state be funding that with?
They would fund that with excess GR. So any money above 4%. So right now is 8% growth in GR for the biennium. You take 4%, spend that on education, increase education spending there, increase healthcare, but then use the other 4%, about $4 billion, and you could potentially buy down about 8% of the school maintenance and operation property tax. It would be a way to not increase new taxes, while at the same time, I agree with you that the rainy day fund is too high. We've actually been saying to lower the cap from 10% down to maybe 7%. And then that way, that other money that's available could be used for other purposes. We'd like to see a tax relief, but there's other things they could look at as well. I know you're ready to go at me.
You say you can do it without tax increases, but we're having tax increases.
Oh, yeah.
It's on local property.
Yeah.
As Donna pointed out, we're down to about the state giving you 35% of the cost of education. It is a state responsibility. It's in the Constitution, one of the few things that we're directed to do, a free and equal education. When I got to town a long time ago,
Come on now.
it was 60%. The state furnished 60% of the cost of education. We're down to 35%, and it's going in the wrong direction. So you're going to pay one way or another. There's no free lunches.
I agree with that.
And so you can say we don't want to raise taxes. The public is begging us for school property tax relief. And I don't mean just a little token amount.
Yeah.
We've got to get away from the local homeowners primarily funding public education.
And what I would say, and it's been pointed out by my colleagues, that this is the formula. This is the system we have in place. You know, it's not something we're doing necessarily. The bucket fills up with property tax first, and the state comes in and fills the other half. or the other part. In 2007, it was the other half, and it very quickly diminished as a consequence of appraisals. And the system then filled up more with property taxes than it did with the requirement for the state. And so the imbalance there occurred as a consequence of a formula that we adopted at some time. But it is a formula, as my colleagues also point out, that is the state's formula. We can change it. We can make the modifications to it. And there's been a whole interim group during this biennium now that has spent countless hours in meetings looking at this that are going to come forward with some fairly challenging, fairly innovative things. We don't get there without putting more money into the system, new money into the system. We don't get property tax relief without putting money in there in order to compress that down. That's going to be in the budget that comes out of the House, and you'll hear about that next week. But so there, and it's all going to be well within the comptroller's BRE, well within it and stuff. But it was something I do want to point out, though, that in this last budget, though, because we've talked a lot about some of this stuff, is that despite us not having any more money, we still made mental health a priority, and we paid more money into the mental health system. We still made higher ed a priority, and to a great degree by Representative Howard's being a champion, we funded Texas grants higher than we had before. And so we did put extra money in some places. Now, yeah, sure, it comes out of something, and maybe we go to the Medicaid piggy bank and take money out of that, in order to make some of these things work, But that even despite, what I would call a very austere budget like last time was, the House and the Senate found a way to come together and say, these are some of the priorities that we need to continue to fund. And you found those in this budget, like you said, that fell well with any kind of limits that you might put out there and so forth. So I do think in the next budget, you're going to see the priorities that have been described and discussed before. I think that, this budget's going to clearly say that school finance is a priority. It's clearly going to say that property tax relief and reform is a priority. We're in a fortunate situation this time where we do have a significant amount of revenue anticipated that we can do some of these things. But as my colleagues say, okay, good today, but how about tomorrow? Are we setting ourselves up in 2021 for that, despite being within these numbers that are spending limit numbers and so forth, are we setting up a situation that we can't sustain going into 2021? We've got to have that conscientiousness about us as we talk about these things and understand that just like in 15, where we thought we were in the best of the best times, turned out we weren't, and certainly, we've got to have that same caution as we look at the budget during this legislative session.
I want to say one more thing, I'm sorry, about the school funding formula and the property taxes, because I think it's important to make sure everybody understands. The chairman mentioned the LARs that he was listening to in drawing up this budget that's going to be proposed. When TEA laid out their LAR, if I can use all the acronyms, they actually
Texas Education
Agency, with their legislative appropriations request, actually asked for $3.5 billion less from the state. They asked for less based on the formula because of this discrepancy in the values going up and how the formula works. So from my perspective, and what I'm suggesting that the legislature consider is, at the very least, any dollars that come to the state collected from taxpayers for public education should go to public education. Now, you certainly could look at some of that going into new programming or some kind of property tax relief. That's all connected to me. But the fact is, if we're talking about truth in taxation, you pay your local property tax bill, and on it says you owe X amount for your schools. You pay that. You may challenge it, but you eventually pay that. You should expect that that's what those dollars are going to. But in fact, with what we got as a legislative request from TEA, we're going to use $3.5 billion from what you've contributed that have reduced our portion that we need to pay into public ed, and we're going to use it on other state services. Well, good for the other state services. I'm glad to have it, believe me. But you're paying for that, whether you know it or not, with your property taxes for schools. And at the very least, we should be spending that money on public education. And that's part of why this dysfunctional system we have in place now is so out of whack.
And one thing I'll just mention, Representative Howard mentioned her record-setting bill of $23 billion to get 50-50. In our bill this time, it's probably the only number I'll share with you, at this time, to get 50-50 by new money, it would be $30 billion. Wow. And so it speaks to her point that it speaks to why we need to do this now, because it's going to get worse. And the next time around, we may not may not be able to rescue what needs to be clearly rescued at this point, reformed, redefined, whatever you want to call it. But I am encouraged by the work that the interim study group has done on our side. Dan Huberty, D.L. Bernal have been involved in these things, and so they have spent a lot of time, come up with some very, very legitimate thoughts, concerns, reforms, ways to improve performance, and so forth out there. A lot of those things are going to come with price tags, or it may come with, okay, we've got X billions of dollars in the bill to spend on school reform, finance reform, and school reform. Tell us how it needs to be spent. That's not me as an appropriator's responsibility. It's just for those of us that sit on that committee to say, okay, here is the money that we reasonably have to be able to do some of these things.
And when you look at the overall budget, which is about $218 billion over a biennium, it's massive, $218 billion. But at the same time, there are 28 million people, right? There are 28 million people across Texas.
We're a massive state.
We're massive. Yeah, we're a $1.7 trillion economy. And it's something, the way that the economy's been growing over time, 3.7% unemployment rate. I always like to mention, too, that the last decade we've created 22% of all jobs across the nation. Yeah. It's just phenomenal what's been able to do here. And that's why, we hope that we can keep that going. But we also understand we do need to make sure that we meet those needs along the way. When you look at the overall budget, setting priorities, healthcare and education alone are the vast majority of the budget. If you look at all funds, I think it's right around 80%. If you look at education, just GR is over 50%. So there are massive amounts of dollars that go into there. So last session, if there wasn't a change in spending, were there efficiency gains? Because sometimes we're talking right now with school finance, they're saying, look, let's take some money here from these indices, weights, better word, and put them over here to maybe try to find some efficiencies within the system. Is that something else that y'all are considering, or what do you think, Senator Whitmire?
Well, first of all, we need to identify what you mean by waste. We've got waiting lists on most of our services. Special ed is not being addressed. And the worst thing I see coming forward is if we go into the rainy day fund, we won't fix school finance. We might make a down payment on it. Donna's numbers, and as the chairman said now, it's $30 billion. That's not going to be fixed when we leave here in 140 days. Yeah. And so that's a kind of grown-up discussion. We had a special session last summer on 20 largely local government issues, to control a community's trees, et cetera. Why don't we have a special session on what's on everyone's mind, have total attention given to school finance, reform the way schools were operated, and we would have really made a contribution to the future. I think our title today was the future. I'm not just worried about how we come out of this session. As the chairman pointed out, what are we going to do in 2021? What are we going to do in 10 and 20 years from now? We have a booming population. The young Hispanic population is only growing. So, folks, we need a grown-up, forget party labels, forget artificial ceilings. Have your elected officials look at the needs, not only now, but going forward, and then come up with a tax system, a state tax system, that will support the growth that we're witnessing. All we're doing is making a down payment so we can say we addressed it. And I'm going to tell you, you're talking about some angry voters, a small reduction in their school property tax is not what they're looking for. And I would suggest the reason we were broke last session was the sessions before. The two before, we had some what was called surpluses, and we gave it back to folks. The increase in homestead exemption, there was $100 per average Texas family realized from that. We reduced the franchise tax. And all of that is good politics. But the truth is, the sober discussion is, we've got some serious unmet needs going forward. And we have these constitutional limitations, but we can sit down and talk about it. And I would do it in a special session where we don't. Bob Bullock used to lock us up in a room in the 90s when we had a problem and said, don't come out till you fix it. If you weren't in the room working on it, Bill Radcliffe was our chairman of finance. He would come up. We need additional revenue. We added some items to the sales tax charges. And you'd tell Bullock, no, I'm not for that. He said, well, what's your plan? I don't have one. I wasn't in there. He said, well, then you're for that one. So we need some serious, sober discussion about this, where we go from here.
That's
So
good.
thank you for having
One
this
thing I would
discussion.
point out on that, I happened to be talking to Dan Huberty about this, and I talked about the prolific number of meetings and hours they spend. He said, John, he says, I've been in 52 meetings in the interim related to school finance, 40 specifically related to the interim group that was appointed and stuff. And he says, I don't feel like there's been an interim. He says, I feel like I've been in session during this whole period of time. You know?
And in the meantime, you had a campaign.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you got a real race you got to run too. You know,
And work private sector too. He's busy. So, well, thank you all so much for these comments. We're going to go to some Q&A from the audience now. So if you would, please raise your hand. Someone is coming with a mic. And please turn your brief comment into a question. Let's keep it questions and have so we can have as many as possible. Let's start right up here. Go to the front, Elliot.
Mr. Zerwas, you're my representative, and so Harvey was a big deal. I'm a civil engineer. I don't think we're going to solve the education thing today, so I'd like to talk about the rainy day fund for the rainy day that we experienced. And so a reservoir, could be the solution, and that would be a big one-time expense that could be pulled out of the rainy day fund. Is that being discussed, or some plan like that? And I know there's also a water plan statewide. Is there something that's on the shelf that the hydrologists, had already kind of put together, but that was not funded? I know there's a $50 billion water plan, but that's drinking water and things. I don't know about the drainage side of things. I was wondering if that.
Yeah, well, great question, and thanks for being here. Appreciate that. We obviously experienced significant flooding, and there is, as the senator pointed out, a need for a third reservoir in order. Really more to protect the Houston area than our particular area. We got caught in the backwash of dam, but there could be some impact there, but the big impact would be to the greater Houston area there. But nevertheless, it needs to be done. It was identified in the 30s as needing to be done. Nothing has changed since then. They didn't do it then because they didn't have the money to do it then. And we all know, based on the Corps of Engineers, and everybody talks about it, the way water drains hasn't changed that much, and that there continues to be a need out there. The cost of that is somewhere south of $500 million. Yeah, we got the money to do that. Is it our responsibility? It's the federal government's responsibility. We know that, I personally am supportive of that. I do think that it's a good way for us to spend that money, especially for those purposes. The impact, the economic impact, not to mention the humanitarian issue associated with flooding, what's going to be the third largest city in the nation, is a dramatic impact to the economy of the state of Texas, and that's something that could be done. We're blessed to be in this position that most states are not, by having a tremendous amount of money in our economic stabilization fund, which, just to point out, we have largely abandoned that purpose to stabilize our economy, and the narrative around it has been reframed as a one-time use rainy day fund for the most horrific circumstance. Okay, fine. That's what we had. And so it is identified in the governor's report and the Chancellor Sharp's report on this as far as priority things that need to be done, and that ranks obviously very high up there. I frankly am not aware of whether that's going to be taken up in a legislative venue here today or in the next 140 days. But certainly I think those top priorities are going to be considered. Senator, I don't know if you have any different thoughts on that, because obviously the direct impact is to the city of Houston.
I can't think of a better use of the rainy day fund. I was here in 1988 when it was created, and I was at the table, and the discussion was, let's create a savings account for stabilization purposes, and if we can ever get it to $200 million, we will have really been leaders. Well, we went past that, and the projections will be $15 billion. But you're not going to spend that kind of investment if you have these arbitrary growth restrictions. I mean, that's something that ought to be done. And I agree the federal government could be challenged to do it. Harris County just passed a $2.5 billion flood bond, and it's not in their plans. But we, as leaders, cannot sit around and have excuses for why it's not getting done when we have the ability to do it. And I can't think of a more serious part. I mean, it's amazing. It was not the rain and the flooding. It was the release of the money from the reservoirs. And if you don't have the third, we're living on a time bomb. I mean, it will happen. I can't imagine. And of course, this flood panel, but we got to have a better notice to families, a little bit of notice before their houses are flooding at 2 a.m. because someone's releasing and concerned about the inadequacy of the reservoirs.
Let me just quickly say, too, that any spending, even that kind of spending out of the ESF, still counts towards our spending limit.
Sure.
So that's also a constraint we have, because we are constrained by both the spending limit and the pay-as-you-go, two constitutional governors on what we can do. So again, trying to limit us even more than what we already have is a challenge when we want to do something like this, spend significant amounts of money to invest in infrastructure that's very important to the life of Texas residents and to our economy. It counts against our spending limit. So making even more constraints there would, I think, be problematic.
All right. Next question. Yeah, right back here. Elliot.
Thank you. So back to the education question. We see a lot of schools that have not only, you get property taxes, but you also have bond elections. They hire staff to do fundraisers. They have branding corporations coming in and getting revenues from that, and yet they're always under budget. Always over budget. So my question is, do you have a strategy in place when you talk about reducing waste, strategies to implement reducing waste, like a template, budget templates for not only to match the student demographics as well as brick and mortar of the situation within each geographical location? And then, unfortunately, I've seen several cases where these schools have monstrosity football stadiums being built, and their test scores are abysmal. Their test results their reading scores are abysmal. And yet they have, and their vocational trades are being neglected. So please let me know if you have a strategy in place to implement something to reduce waste, fraud, and yet they all have iPads too that their
Sure.
faces are glued to. So some kind of strategy.
Yeah. Anything?
Well, I'll do a quick one. First thing I would do is I would pass a sunset provision for school districts. I think Houston is over 200,000 kids. I don't know that it can be managed adequately. You got some school districts with 60 students. I would make all the school districts to come in and justify their existence. And, we'd probably have to do it in closed doors because of Friday night football. You're talking about the stadium. But there's no way we can efficiency, in my judgment, have 1,050 school districts. You come up 290 from Houston, you go through Brenham, county seat, good school district. 10 minutes up the road is Burton. Why wouldn't Burton go in, the students at the Burton 200-plus school students go over to Brenham? So it's those kind of tough, once-in-a-generation decisions that need to be made. Now, what's amazing to me is I see the bond elections too. People will tax themselves through a bond election. Forget the football, that's a special item. But the legislature will not tax them to run the schools. And we've actually had a couple of instances where they build the schools and they don't have the personnel to open it. And let me just also mention, it's hard to just say the schools. I mean, what Houston School District goes through on a daily basis with their profile of their students, about 90% of their students get all 3 meals. So the schools are not just educating the kids, it's the social health care, mental health system of the community. Versus you go to the Woodlands, they've got a lot better situation. So we probably need to get creative about how we address individual school districts' challenges. And for sure, I think we got too many schools.
That's really interesting, though, about a sunset.
No, it's a heck of an idea. I think, and somebody will somebody will steal it. I think we need a sunset panel for every school district on a rotating basis to justify their existence. If they can't justify, like in the Big Bend area, there's not a junior high in DeLingua, so they go into Alpine. There's going to be some transportation restrictions, but I just don't think we can continue to afford the luxury of having 1,050 school districts, and I think we ought to make them justify why do you, and they're still creating them, by the way, and it's largely 6-man football out in the rural areas, and our Friday night football in the other areas, and so we waste, in my judgment, lots of money.
Yeah, good discussion. Right over here, please, sir.
I want to thank each and every one of you for being on the panel. I'd like to speak back to you what I heard you say during this panel discussion. I heard the term new funding. I heard the term leftover budget money of $4.1 billion. I heard spending money on the rainy day fund, and I heard raising new funds to spend on new programs that are coming up. I heard our constitutional spending limits, that we are a pay-as-you-go, and but I haven't heard that Texas is number 2 for debt in the United States behind New York. I also haven't heard of anything having to rein in. The state is pretty solvent, but our municipalities, our counties, our school districts are borrowing money like crazy. And I haven't heard anything about paying this debt off, because nothing drags an economy down more than a lot of debt and all that interest rate on the backs of the taxpayers, and it just slows things down. What would you propose to start addressing this situation, getting this debt under control, so that all that money we're paying in interest can go to fund some of these other programs?
Yeah. And I think
I'll tell you one example that came up in a previous session, and it didn't go anywhere, but I thought it was a good idea. It came from one of our senators. He was discussing it at least at some point, and that's Senator Seliger, looking at with our tuition revenue bonds, which we use to help build our universities, the capacity on our university campuses. Rather than incurring the debt, at that time we also had a lot of money in our economic stabilization fund. The talk was, why do we not just do a cash infusion and not have the debt, and over the long run actually save, because we wouldn't be having the interest payments. We didn't choose to go that route, and I don't even know how much traction that actually got. But I think there probably are innovative things like that that we could look at. I don't know if you're suggesting that we should consider some kind of regulation. Perhaps, I'm not sure what you have in mind about this, but you know, debt is obviously something that we all have to be looking at and paying attention to. And we have the opportunities, for one thing, let's say another example, and maybe, John, you understand this better than I do, but the trans, what's it called? When we have to borrow money, the comptroller, the short term, the comptroller has to borrow money at the beginning of the school year, because the property taxes don't come in until midway through the school year, and yet the school districts have to have the money they need to operate. So the comptroller goes out and borrows a certain amount of money, short-term loan, and I'm not sure what the a cost is attached to that. Maybe there's a different way that could be done. I mean,
We actually did that, I believe, in the last session. The comptroller actually has the ability to take rainy day money and use it in situations like that. And so, in fact, TRANS aren't what they call TRANS is the acronym for it. But we actually used rainy day money for that purpose instead. So he was able to bring it over, use it for that purpose, and then put the money back. You know, so it was just basically a bridge. You know, one of the other things that has been batted around, you know, we talk about investment into a legacy fund, this rainy day fund, and spin off, you know, the proceeds of the investments and interest and so forth. There's conversation about using that for the reduction of debt. You know, any place there's a new revenue stream, the reduction of debt always comes up as part of the conversation. We just don't typically have new revenue streams very often to be able to have that conversation and stuff. But I mean, that's a very responsible, realistic thing to do, to say, take $7.5 billion, half the rainy day fund, and put it into a comptroller oversight funded account. And they already do this. This isn't something new. It's modest, but even it was modest rates, $7.5 billion is going to spin off a lot of money. I mean, if you look at, you know, UTEMCO and the PUF funds and the investments those things have returned, you know, I mean, they're safe investments and they return a pretty large sum of money back, you know. Well, those are opportunities to do it. I think you bring up the good point, though, is that the debt reduction needs to be in the conversation, especially at times like this when we are, what I just like to say, flush with cash, you know. So.
And one thing that we've looked at the foundation too is adding debt transparency. So there's more information whenever you're voting on that debt, on that election. How much that's going to add to the overall debt. What's the interest? What's the debt service outstanding? Providing more voter information whenever they're going into the ballot booth to vote on these things will be another step I think we should probably take.
Could I just speak to one thing also? It's not debt, but it reminds me when you talk about transparency and what Representative Howard said about balancing the budget on the back of the dedicated accounts.
Oh, yeah. I was going to ask you about that.
We did make progress on that, and that was an initiation that came out of the House, and for 2 sessions we were able to actually work that down. We had to abandon that last session, frankly, because we didn't have any money. We were trying to shortchange everybody, and eventually we had to depend on those accounts against to certify the budget. But this time that's a very viable conversation again to have, you know, because we're going to be in a place where we don't have to, you know, rely on those dedicated accounts. You know, let them be used for the purposes they're being collected. If you're not going to use them for the purpose they're collected, then quit collecting them. You know, I mean, it's very simple.
That's right. I think we have time for one more short question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. From the perspective of individual rights and responsibilities versus social welfare, how do you perceive the different responsibilities between the state and local city and community responsibilities regarding the funding of schools and mental health needs?
We only got a couple minutes left, so we need to make it really short. Some initial thoughts.
Big one.
That could go a long way.
Yeah, it could go a long way. You know, I don't think there's a clear line of definition of whose responsibility there some of those things are. Those are huge issues that you have out there. You know, when we talk about mental health, you know, we know that we're, you know, the state being, you know, taking the sales, the revenue that you send up to the state, you know, is sent back. A large part of that is sent back, you know, to support mental health initiatives and things of that nature. You know, I mean, if you look at what we're doing in Houston, where, as the senator has pointed out, you know, the largest, you know, mental health treatment arena is the Harris County Jail. but you know, look, they don't get any, or they get very minimal. and they get released with 2 weeks worth of medication, and the medication wears off and they circle back into the prison system. And so there has been a large effort, to try to enhance the Harris County Psychiatric Center, and large money has been infused into it, significant expansion. That's come out of the rainy day fund this time. I think, a very appropriate use to try to, bring some relief there. And in fact, in order to help with the state mental health hospitals, which are post-World War II era buildings in some cases, we have embarked on a 6-year effort to try to basically completely either rebuild or consolidate or just make more modern these facilities. And we started that with around a $300 million rainy day fund expense last time. This time it'll come up again. We'll have the conversation, but it's always intended that it's about an $800 million commitment that will pull that out of rainy day each time and then get across the finish line, hopefully in the next 4 years.
Excellent.
I'm sorry, it didn't quite touch everything you were talking about and stuff, and I apologize. Happy to chat with you after the meeting about that a little bit.
That'll be good. Well, I think we went over a lot of the key budget priorities, a lot of things to look forward to this session. We thank you for what you all do and continue to do. We look forward to working with you more. Representative Howard, we always have some good back and forth on Twitter. That's always fun as well. And but there's just so many things that are in these budgets, and setting priorities is so important. We hope that the taxpayer will also be a part of the priorities. So we look forward to all the great work that y'all are going to do this session. So thank y'all so much. Please give them a round of applause.